Black girl makes surprising revelation in court that emotionally touches everyone and ends up saving her mother from a desperate situation. The soft morning light filtered through the window of the small apartment where Ava Johnson and her mother, Danielle, shared a cozy yet modest space. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the aroma of the books stacked on the coffee table. Danielle sat in an old armchair, her face radiating warmth as she looked at her daughter. "Come here, Ava. Today we're going to read about someone very special," she said, opening a book Ava had seen many times before, but that always fascinated her. Ava, with her curly hair and curious eyes, moved closer and settled next to her mother. "Who is it this time, Mom?" she asked eagerly. "Today it's about Rosa Parks. Do you know who she was?" Danielle began to read aloud, her warm tone bringing the words to life. Rosa Parks was a courageous woman who refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus. She became a symbol of the struggle for civil rights. Ava listened intently, feeling a connection to the strength represented by those figures. "She was so brave," she murmured, admiring Parks' determination. Danielle smiled and replied, "Yes, my daughter, and you can be brave too. Always fight for the truth and what is right." Her mother's words echoed in her mind, unaware that soon they would be tested in an unexpected way. Meanwhile, in an opulent mansion across town, the Harrington family was preparing for a party. Mrs. Harrington, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of superiority, scrutinized the preparations, as if every detail was vital to maintaining her impeccable image. "Where is the jewel I left on the table in the living room?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air. Panic swept over the staff, and within minutes what was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a battlefield in search of the lost item. "It must be here somewhere. I didn't lose it," Mrs. Harrington shouted, her frustration quickly morphing into anger. With a contemptuous expression, she pointed at Danielle, who was working as a waitress at the party. "It was her. I have no doubt that this woman stole the jewel," she accused, without any evidence or reason. A murmur of indignation spread among the guests, and all eyes turned to Danielle, who, terrified, tried to comprehend what was happening. Ava, who had been left at home by her mother, arrived just in time to overhear the conversation, hiding behind a plant. Her heart raced as she realized the injustice unfolding before her eyes. Mrs. Harrington's gaze was filled with disdain, and Ava could feel the anger boiling within her. "How can someone be so cruel?" she thought, feeling powerless. As the urgency to act grew with each passing second, the police arrived. Mrs. Harrington wasted no time reiterating her accusations. "She's a criminal. Look at her. We can't let people like her roam free," she exclaimed, her voice resonating with superiority. Ava wanted to scream to defend her mother, but the words were caught in her throat. "What can I do?" she thought, feeling small and insignificant in the face of the power and prejudice surrounding her life. That night, while the city slept, Ava couldn't close her eyes. Her mother's words about fighting for the truth echoed in her mind, but fear and uncertainty paralyzed her. "What can I do to help?" she questioned herself, as the injustice threatened to take her mother away. The weight of responsibility began to settle in her heart, and Ava knew that sooner or later she would have to find the courage to face the world and fight for the truth. Ava Johnson walked through the school hallways with a heavy heart, her mind swirling with worries. The image of her mother, Danielle, being unjustly accused wouldn't leave her head. That day, she decided she needed to vent and seek support, even if it was just from a friend. When she spotted Emily, her classmate, she felt a small relief. Emily had always been a good friend, and Ava hoped she could understand what was happening in her life. "Hey, Emily, can I talk to you for a minute?" Ava called, forcing a smile that barely reached her eyes. Emily, a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, looked at Ava with disinterest. "Sure, what's up?" Ava hesitated. "It's about my mom. She's facing problems and I don't know what to do." Mrs. Harrington accused her of stealing a jewel. Emily's expression changed, but not in the way Ava had hoped. "Really? You know the Harringtons are rich and powerful, right? They must have their reasons. Sometimes people do wrong things and end up being held responsible." "But it's not true," Ava exclaimed, a bit louder than she intended. "My mom didn't do anything. It's all a lie." Emily crossed her arms and looked at the ground. "Look, Ava, I don't know. My mom always said that people like your mom, well, they aren't trustworthy." "What do you mean, people like my mom?" Ava's indignation was rising, and she felt tears threatening to spill. "You know that's just prejudice. You can't believe everything you hear at home." "I'm just saying what I heard," Emily replied, her defensive tone becoming more apparent. "It won't be easy for your mom, and you need to prepare for that." Ava felt the knot tighten in her chest. "You really don't understand, do you? This isn't just about my mom. It's about injustice. And what do you do when someone you love is being treated like this?" The tension between them escalated, and Ava realized their friendship was on the brink of a chasm. "Ava, I can't get involved in this," Emily said, stepping away. "I need to go to class." Ava watched as Emily walked away, the pain of rejection mingling with frustration. She turned and walked down the hallway, feeling more alone than ever. The echo of laughter and conversations from other students surrounded her, but she felt trapped in a bubble of sadness. Later, when she got home, Danielle noticed that something was wrong. The worried expression on her mother's face made Ava feel a little better, but the sadness still weighed heavily on her. "What happened, my love?" Danielle asked, sitting next to Ava on the couch. "At school, I talked to Emily about you. She doesn't believe me, Mom. She thinks you're guilty," Ava said, her voice trembling. Danielle sighed, and a look of understanding crossed her face. "Ava, I know it's hard. Many people don't understand the truth, and it's easy to believe in lies, especially when they come from those in power. But it's not fair. I want to do something," Ava exclaimed, her hands balling into fists. "I can't let people think that about you." Danielle stroked her daughter's hair, the tenderness of her touch contrasting with the harshness of the situation. "The truth will always find a way, my dear. Remember what your father always said. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something is more important than fear." Ava looked into her mother's eyes, feeling the strength in her words. "I don't want to be afraid, Mom. I want to fight for the truth." Danielle smiled, a glimmer of hope lighting her gaze. "And you will, Ava. Just remember that the fight can be lonely, but we are never alone. The truth is a light that shines in the darkness, and we must never stop believing in it." The day of the accusation finally arrived, and the atmosphere around the courthouse was heavy, laden with tension and expectations. Ava felt a whirlwind of emotions as she watched the community gather. Many people had assembled outside the courthouse, holding signs that called for justice and support for her mother. The girl pressed herself against the cold wall of the hallway, seeking some comfort in the crowd around her. The spirit of struggle and solidarity emanating from the group inspired her, but also made her even more anxious. "Look, Ava," shouted a familiar voice. It was Jamal, her friend from the neighborhood. He approached, his smile brightening the scene. "Everyone is here for your..." "This is amazing. I just hope the judge sees the truth," Ava replied, her voice trembling. "I can't stop thinking about what Mrs. Harrington said. She's wrong, but what if no one believes us?" Jamal put his hand on her shoulder. "You have to believe. Remember when we played ball and you didn't give up even when you were losing? It's the same thing. Fight for your mom." Ava nodded, still feeling the weight of responsibility. The group of protesters shouted words of encouragement, and Ava felt a warmth grow inside her. "I need to go in," she said, determined. "I have to do this for her." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was oppressive. The walls were adorned with dark wood, and the faces of the jurors were impassive. Ava sat in the front row, her heart racing with each passing minute. She glanced at the defense table where her mother Danielle sat, visibly nervous but trying to maintain her composure. The defense attorney appeared unprepared, which worried her even more. Danielle's gaze met Ava's, and the girl made an encouraging gesture. Danielle smiled faintly, but Ava could sense the worry in her eyes. "Today is the day," murmured Mrs. Harrington, her voice sharp as glass. She was seated at her table, a triumphant expression on her face. Beside her, her husband nodded in agreement, clearly supporting the unfounded accusations against Danielle. Ava felt nauseated seeing the contempt with which Mrs. Harrington looked at her mother. The hearing began, and the words of the prosecuting attorney echoed in the courtroom, filled with fervor and emotion. The accused, Danielle Johnson, was seen at the Harringtons' house where a valuable item went missing. The blame clearly lies with her, a black woman who works as a cleaner. "We cannot Ava felt a knot in her throat. How could people accept these lies? She scanned the jurors, trying to decipher their expressions. Some looked skeptical, but others seemed inclined to believe the Harringtons' premeditated narrative. "She didn't do anything," Ava whispered to herself as a murmur of support spread through the room from the group of demonstrators outside. She needed to do something, but doubt paralyzed her. She remembered her father's words, "Courage is not the absence of fear, it's the determination to act despite it." With her heart racing, Ava took a deep breath. Her mother's defense began to present its case, But the weak arguments seemed to have no impact. The attorney appeared lost and Ava's hope began to fade. She looked again at the prosecution table and saw Mrs. Harrington smiling, as if she had already won. "I can't let this happen," Ava murmured, clenching her fists. Remembering everything she had read in her father's journal and the stories of courage her mother had always shared, she knew she needed to stand up and fight for the truth. But fear still consumed her. How could she face the powerful Harrington family? The pressure of the situation mounted, and courage felt increasingly distant. Ava felt tears welling in her eyes, but when she looked at her mother, she saw Danielle watching her with love and hope. What more could she do but fight? The weight of injustice was heavy, but Ava felt that if she didn't try, she would be allowing the truth to be suffocated by lies. And, as terrified as she was, a spark of determination began to ignite within her. After all, the fight for justice was not just for her mother, but for all the voices that had been silenced. Ava sat in her small room, surrounded by posters of historical figures she admired, like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. The afternoon sun filtered through the window, creating a play of shadows and light on the floor. However, the light that usually comforted her did not seem enough to dispel the darkness that surrounded her. The weight of the injustice her mother faced was almost unbearable. With trembling hands, she reached for a cardboard box hidden beneath her bed. Inside were letters and keepsakes from her father, who had passed away when she was very young. Ava pulled out a worn diary, its yellowed pages revealing her father's handwriting. As she flipped through the pages, she found a note that made her heart race. "The truth is like a light that cannot be extinguished, even in the darkest nights. Fight for it, daughter." Ava's eyes sparkled with determination as she read the words that seemed to echo in her mind. "I need to do this for you, Dad," she murmured, feeling a wave of courage swell within her. At that moment she decided she needed help. Ava ran over to her friend Marcus's house, who lived on the same street. He had always been a source of support and encouragement, and she needed someone by her side to face the battle ahead. When she arrived, Marcus's mother greeted her with a warm smile. "Hi, Ava. Marcus is in the backyard. I'll go get him." A few minutes later, Marcus appeared, sweaty and smiling, with a basketball in one hand and a cup of lemonade in the other. "Hey, Ava, what are you doing here?" Ava hesitated for a moment, but the urgency of her situation made her open up. "Marcus, I need help. It's about my mom. She's being accused of something she didn't do, and I don't know what to do." Marcus's eyes grew serious. "I heard about that. It's really unfair. What are you thinking of doing?" "I found some things my dad wrote about fighting for the truth. I want to testify in court, but I'm scared. What if they don't believe me?" The anguish was clear in Ava's voice. "Hey, you're stronger than you think. If you saw something, you need to tell it. Let's practice what you're going to say. You can do this, Ava. I'll be there with you, don't worry." Marcus's confidence calmed Ava's nerves a bit. With Marcus's support, they sat on an old swing in the yard and began to rehearse. "Okay, start from the beginning. What did you see?" Marcus asked, looking at her intently. Ava took a deep breath and started to speak, trying to find the right words. "At the party, I was in the living room and saw Grace Harrington playing with the jewel. She seemed so happy, but then I saw her leave the jewel on the table and run out." "Great, what else?" Marcus encouraged. "And then I heard her talking to her friends, saying she lost the jewel and was scared of her mom. That is important, right?" "Definitely. If you say that in court, it could change everything. Remember, Ava, the truth always prevails." As they practiced, Ava started to feel a small spark of hope ignite within her. With each word she spoke, her confidence grew. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Ava felt she was preparing for something bigger than herself. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what I would do without you," she said, a shy smile on her lips. "We're in this together always. Now let's go," Marcus replied, clapping his hands. They stood up, ready to face whatever was to come. For the first time in a long while, Ava felt she had the strength to fight for the truth and above all for her mother. The courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. Ava sat in the front row, closely observing the faces of the jurors, who appeared as impassive as the marble walls surrounding them. The judge, in his black robe and serious expression, conducted the proceedings with the necessary gravity, but Ava felt that justice was far from being served. Her mother's defense words, shaky and weak, echoed in her mind, and a wave of despair began to wash over her. "Why doesn't anyone believe my mum?" Ava thought, biting her lips to hold back tears. She remembered the stories Danielle had told about the importance of truth and courage. But now, at such a crucial moment, all she wanted was for her mum to be home, safe and free of accusations. The worried look on Danielle's face, sitting next to her lawyer, made Ava feel even more powerless. The prosecution attorney, a man in a dark suit with an imposing posture, stood up again to question her mother. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice resonating with firmness, "were you at the Harrington party the night the jewel went missing?" "Yes," Danielle replied, her voice trembling but determined. "I was there helping as a waitress." "And do you recall seeing the jewel at any point?" the lawyer asked, a cynical smile forming on his lips. "Or did you simply take it while you were there?" Ava felt a tightness in her chest. The injustice was palpable. She looked at the jurors, searching for a sign of empathy, but saw only indifference. The defense attorney seemed lost, as if he didn't know how to combat the avalanche of prejudice that was weighing down on her mother. Ava took a deep breath, her heart pounding. The memory of her father's journal, filled with notes about courage and truth, flashed through her mind. "I have to do this," she thought, as hesitation consumed her. Looking around, she noticed familiar faces in the audience, friends and community members who had come to support her mother. Determination began to rise within her. When the defense attorney finally called her to testify, Ava felt a chill in her stomach. "Ava Johnson," he said, and his voice echoed in the silent room. "Can you tell us what you saw that night?" Ava stood up, tension coursing through her muscles, making her tremble. With hesitant steps, she approached the witness stand where she sat, her hands sweaty and mind racing. I saw what happened," she began, stammering. "I was there during the party. Can you tell us what you saw?" The attorney pressed, his voice gentle yet firm. Ava looked at the audience, where her mother was watching her, eyes filled with hope. "I saw Grace Harrington, Mrs. Harrington's daughter," Ava said, her voice starting to strengthen. "She was playing with the jewel and she lost it." A murmur swept through the room. The prosecution attorney frowned, but Ava was determined to continue. "I heard Grace telling her friends that she lost the jewel and was worried about what her mum would say. She didn't want her mum to be mad." The silence in the room was almost deafening. Ava felt every gaze fixed on her, and the pressure mounted. But the memory of her father's teachings propelled her forward. She knew what she was saying was important, that the truth needed to be heard. "And then," Ava continued, "I heard Mrs. Harrington saying they needed to blame someone. She wanted my mum to be the one blamed. I heard all of this." Ava's voice grew louder, full of emotion. "My mum didn't do anything wrong. The jewel wasn't hers, and Grace is the one who really lost it." With those words, Ava felt she had released a part of herself. Now everything depended on the response from the room, and the truth she longed for began to emerge from the shadows of prejudice that had dominated that place. She hoped that, finally, justice could prevail. Ava sat on the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest, her trembling hand gripping the microphone. The courtroom was silent, the anticipation hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The jurors were watching her, and the tension in the room was palpable. She looked around, recognizing the familiar faces of the community who had come to support her mother. That connection encouraged her, but the pressure to speak about what she had witnessed was almost overwhelming. "You can start when you're ready, Ava," the defense attorney said, a middle-aged man with an encouraging look. He leaned slightly forward, encouraging her to speak. Ava took a deep breath, recalling her father's words about the importance of truth. She remembered the lesson he always emphasized. Truth is power. Don't be afraid to use it. With that in mind, she began. I was at the party," Ava said, her voice a bit shaky. "I saw Grace Harrington playing with the missing jewel." The courtroom, which had been in absolute silence, now buzzed with murmurs of curiosity. "Go on," the lawyer urged, while some jurors exchanged skeptical glances. "She was showing it to her friends," Ava continued, her confidence growing a bit. "I was nearby and I saw when she dropped it. I didn't realize she had lost it until I heard people talking about what happened." Ava noticed Mrs. Harrington shift in her seat, her face contorting in despair. "That's a lie," she shouted, but the judge quickly silenced her with a stern look. "Please continue, Ava," the judge said, his voice firm. Ava felt a chill in her stomach, but decided she couldn't back down. "I heard Grace talking to her friends," she said, each word coming more clearly. "She said that she lost the jewel and that they needed to say it was Danielle who stole it. She was afraid her mother would get mad." The courtroom fell silent, and Ava could feel everyone's eyes on her. Mrs. Harrington, furious, started to rise from her chair, but the judge intervened again. "Mrs. Harrington, if you don't sit down, I'll have to ask you to leave the room." Ava took a deep breath, her heart racing as her father's words echoed in her mind. Courage comes from within, Ava. Never forget that. She looked at the judge and the jurors, realizing that despite her fear, this was her chance to make a difference. Grace was trying to protect her mother, Ava said, her voice now more resolute. "But it's not fair to blame my mom for something she didn't do. I saw what happened, and the truth is that Grace lost the jewel and no one did anything to find it." The courtroom was in complete silence, the tension filling the air as the jurors seemed to process her words. Ava saw some of them exchange glances, and a wave of hope began to wash over her. "Ava, do you have anything else to say?" asked Danielle's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, while Mrs. Harrington tried to compose herself, but the fury on her face was unmistakable. "Yes," Ava said, swallowing hard. "If I didn't tell the truth, I would be betraying my mom and my dad. He always taught me that we must fight against injustice no matter how difficult it is." Her words resonated in the courtroom, and Mrs. Harrington, realizing that what was about to happen could change everything, tried to interrupt. "This is absurd. You're lying, girl. You don't know what you're talking about." The judge again made an authoritative gesture. "Mrs. Harrington, I've warned you. If you continue, I will have to expel you." Ava felt the weight of the situation on her shoulders, but determination was growing inside her. She knew the truth was on her side, and that no matter how scary it was, she couldn't allow injustice to prevail. With a resolute look, she prepared for what would come next. The courtroom was tense in silence, and all eyes turned to Ava, who stood nervously. As she prepared to testify, a wave of emotions washed over her. The fear of speaking the truth mixed with the determination she found in her father's words. Danielle's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, watched the young girl with an encouraging expression, and that gave Ava a little more courage. "You can do this, Ava," he whispered as she made her way to the witness stand. The judge, a middle-aged man with an authoritative presence, looked at her with a serious yet kind expression. "Please state your name and age for the court," the judge ordered. "Ava Johnson, 12 years old," she replied, her voice a little shaky, but firm enough for everyone to hear. "Why are you here today?" the judge asked, softening the seriousness of the situation with an encouraging look. Ava took a deep breath, remembering her mother's comforting words. "I saw what happened at the Harrington party," she declared, trying to keep her voice steady. "I saw Grace Harrington with the jewel before it disappeared." Murmurs began to echo through the room, and the jurors exchanged glances. The prosecution attorney, a robust and imposing man, quickly stood up. "Ava, are you claiming that the Harrington's daughter had the jewel? How can you be sure of that?" Ava looked at the attorney and then at the audience. She felt the weight of all those gazes, but her father's reminder pushed her forward. "Yes, I saw she was playing with the jewel. I saw her put it in a box before it disappeared." The prosecution attorney shook his head, trying to discredit the young girl. "But you're just a child, aren't you? Wouldn't it be easy for you to confuse things?" Ava felt anger rising within her. "No, I'm not confusing anything. I saw with my own eyes. Grace had the jewel, and the only reason my mom is here is that Mrs. Harrington decided to blame her." The courtroom fell silent again, and the tension was palpable. "Can you tell us what else you heard at that party?" the defense attorney asked, encouraging her to continue. Ava looked at him, feeling more confident. "I heard Grace talking to her friends about the jewel. She said she lost it and didn't know how to tell her mum. I heard her say she was afraid of being punished," Ava revealed, her voice now stronger. She could feel the energy in the room shifting, as if a new light was coming on. The defense attorney, realizing the opportunity, paused dramatically before continuing. "And can you tell us, Ava, how this has made you feel? What do you think about what happened to your mother?" Ava looked into the attorney's eyes and then at the jurors. "I feel sad and frustrated. My mom is innocent. She didn't do anything wrong. And all of this is happening because of lies. It's unfair, and I can't stay silent while this is happening." Ava's words echoed in the courtroom, and emotion began to spread among those present. The jurors seemed more attentive, and even some audience members were wiping away tears. The defense attorney, sensing the change in atmosphere, pressed a bit more. "Can you tell us how the accusation has affected you and your mother?" he asked, his voice softened with empathy. "My mom is scared. She doesn't deserve this. We're going through a difficult time, and all I want is for the truth to come to light," Ava replied, her determination growing in her voice. "The truth is important. We need it to live in peace." Ava felt the weight of the words she had just spoken. She was fighting not just for her mother, but for all the people who had been treated unjustly. The courtroom was silent, but a wave of support seemed to radiate from the audience. She had found her voice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The community had gathered outside, holding colorful signs that cried out for justice. Ava watched, her heart racing as the supportive voices echoed, creating a cloak of courage around her. This was the strength she needed. She took a deep breath, remembering her mother's words and her father's diary, which inspired her to be the voice of truth. "You're not alone, Ava," shouted a woman from the crowd, holding up a sign that read, "Justice for Danielle." That voice was just one among many, but it made Ava feel that her fight was not hers alone. It was for the entire community, for everyone who had ever faced injustice. Inside the courtroom, Mrs. Harrington seemed increasingly nervous, her eyes casting furious glances in Ava's direction. She felt threatened by the presence of that girl, who, with her courage, was beginning to dismantle the foundations of her lies. The woman leaned toward her lawyer, murmuring something that Ava couldn't hear, but it made her stomach drop. "Do you think the truth will prevail?" asked Danielle's defense attorney, a middle-aged man who had always believed in the woman's innocence. He stepped closer to Ava, a look of encouragement in his eyes. "Ava, you need to be strong. What you saw is important." "And what if no one believes me?" Ava murmured, her eyes shining with insecurity. "You speak from the truth of your heart, and the truth is powerful." "People will listen to you," he replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ava nodded, feeling a new wave of determination. As Mrs. Harrington tried to shift the narrative with her empty arguments, Ava noticed that the atmosphere in the courtroom was changing. The jurors, who had seemed disinterested before, were now listening intently. Danielle's defense attorney was firm, but Ava knew she needed to do more. The truth had to be exposed. Outside, more people joined the protest, the energy growing. Ava heard the shouts and words of encouragement reaching her ears. "Ava! Ava! Ava!" echoed, and it made her feel she had to act. "I need to go in there," she said to the defense attorney, her voice trembling. "Ava, are you ready?" he asked, noticing the determination in her eyes. "Yes, I know what I saw. I need to tell the truth," she replied, with a firmness that surprised even herself. The attorney smiled, admiring the girl's courage. When it was her turn to testify, Ava felt her heart race. The judge invited her to come forward, and she walked slowly, feeling all eyes on her. Mrs. Harrington watched with disdain, but Ava stood firm. "Can you introduce yourself?" the judge asked, his voice gentle but authoritative. "My name is Ava Johnson," she replied, her voice a bit hesitant but clear. "I am Danielle Johnson's daughter." The murmurs in the room grew, and Ava felt a bit stronger. "What did you see at the Harrington family party?" the defense attorney asked, looking directly into her eyes, encouraging her to continue. I saw Grace Harrington with the jewel. She was playing with it before it disappeared. Then I heard Mrs. Harrington say that my mom was to blame," Ava began, her voice trembling but resolute. "She did nothing wrong. Grace lost the jewel, and her mom forced her to blame my mom so she wouldn't look like a liar." The courtroom fell silent. The jurors looked at each other, clearly impacted by Ava's words. Mrs. Harrington, realizing the truth was unfolding, tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced her with a gesture. "Silence, Mrs. Harrington. Let the girl speak," he ordered, and Ava felt a wave of relief. The community outside the courtroom fell silent, anxious as Ava continued. "I'm not just a kid. I know what's right and what's wrong. My mom is not a criminal," she declared, her voice now stronger. The truth was finally being heard, and she would not let herself be shaken. Grace Harrington was nervous as she awaited her turn to testify. The courtroom was full, and the jurors, lawyers, and community members' gazes weighed heavily on her shoulders. She knew the truth was about to be revealed, but the pressure from her mother and the legacy her family represented was overwhelming. Mrs. Harrington had repeatedly told her that the family's reputation was at stake and that she needed to do what was right to protect the Harringtons' honor. But what was right? Grace took a deep breath, recalling Ava's determined look as the girl recounted her version of events with a clarity that resonated throughout the room. When the judge finally called her name, Grace stood up, hesitating for a moment before taking her first step. The murmurs of the audience quieted, and all eyes were on her. "Please, just tell the truth," she whispered to herself as she approached the witness stand. As she sat down, she looked at Ava, who watched her with a mix of relief and expectation. "Can you please tell us your name?" asked Danielle's defense attorney, a middle-aged man with a kind but firm expression. "Grace Harrington," she replied, her voice trembling. "I am Mrs. Harrington's daughter." "Grace," the attorney began, "were you present at the party that took place at your house the night the jewel went missing?" "Yes," Grace answered, feeling a wave of heat wash over her face. "I was. Do you remember seeing the jewel at any point during the party?" She swallowed hard, the memory haunting her. "Yes, I played with the jewel. I put it in my pocket." "Can you explain what happened after that?" the attorney continued, observing her every move. Grace hesitated, recalling the conversation she had with her friends shortly after the party, the moment she decided to hide the truth. I couldn't find it after a while, and then, when my mum started asking about the jewel, I got scared. She told me to blame Mrs. Danielle." The courtroom seemed to freeze. The low murmurs began to grow as Grace's words hung in the heavy air. She looked at Ava, who watched her with a mix of relief and anticipation. "So you are saying that Mrs. Danielle had nothing to do with the jewel's disappearance?" the defense attorney asked, his voice firm. "Yes," Grace admitted, her voice now stronger. I lost the jewel, and my mother forced me to blame Mrs. Danielle." Mrs. Harrington, who was sitting in the witness stand, turned pale, her gaze locked on Grace, as if trying to convey a final warning. But Grace didn't let herself be intimidated. The truth was coming out and there was no turning back. "Can you tell us how you felt making that choice?" the attorney insisted, his question resonating in the silent room. "I felt terrible," Grace replied, her voice filled with emotion. "I knew it was wrong, but I wanted to protect my family. I didn't think about the consequences, and now I see how much it hurt Mrs. Danielle and Ava." The attorney smiled slightly, encouraging her to continue. "Do you regret what happened?" "Yes," Grace said, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ava. I didn't want this to happen." The room was in complete silence, all eyes on Grace, who was finally freeing herself from the burden she had been carrying. The defense attorney paused, allowing Grace's words to settle. With a firm gesture, he turned to the jurors. "Ladies and gentlemen, here we have a young woman who had the courage to tell the truth even under pressure from her own family. The charges against Mrs. Danielle don't hold up. What more do we need to see the truth?" The jury began murmuring among themselves, the atmosphere in the courtroom slowly shifting. The truth, a powerful force, was starting to establish itself, and justice seemed finally within reach. The jury returned to the courtroom, and the silence that followed was deafening. Assessing everyone's expressions, Ava felt her heart race. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the whole world was watching this decisive moment. When the judge, with a firm voice, asked the jury spokesperson to stand, Ava held her mother's hand, Danielle's, tightly, seeking comfort in her touch. "Accused Danielle Johnson, the jury finds you not guilty." The word "not guilty" echoed throughout the courtroom, and Ava felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. Tears began to stream down her face as a cry of joy exploded in her chest. The community that had gathered outside now flooded the space, caught up in a whirlwind of emotion and celebration. "We did it, Mom! We did it!" Ava exclaimed, hugging Danielle with all her might. Danielle, her eyes filled with tears of relief and happiness, wrapped her daughter in a tight embrace. "You were amazing, Ava. You showed courage when I needed it most. I always knew you were special." As the euphoria took over the courtroom, Mrs. Harrington, who had previously maintained an arrogant stance, seemed to crumble, her face contorted in a mix of rage and shame. She tried to compose herself, but the truth was exposed and there was no way to reverse it. "This isn't fair. You don't know what you're doing," she shouted, her voice trembling. Ava, wiping her tears, turned to Mrs. Harrington. "Fair? What you did to my mom wasn't fair. You accused her without thinking about the consequences. You didn't care about the truth. You just wanted to protect your image." Ava's intense gaze locked onto the woman, who recoiled as if struck by the force of the girl's words. The community, now united in celebration, surrounded Ava and Danielle. "You're our heroines!" shouted one of the protesters, while others began to applaud. The atmosphere was charged with emotion and solidarity. Ava looked around and saw familiar faces, friends and neighbors who had fought alongside them. It was a moment of collective triumph. When Mrs. Harrington turned to Grace, who was standing beside her, the young girl seemed different. With eyes filled with regret, Grace finally spoke, her voice hesitant but firm. "I'm sorry, Ava. I didn't want any of this to happen. My mum forced me, and now I see how wrong it was. I'm really sorry." Ava, surprised by the confession, took a deep breath. "I don't want you to feel bad, Grace. I just want you to understand that the truth always comes out, and that we can all learn from our mistakes." The sincerity in Ava's words caused Grace to lower her head, recognizing the strength of the message. Danielle, with a radiant smile, looked at her daughter and then at the crowd. "Today, we didn't just fight for justice for me, but for a better future for everyone. This fight doesn't end here. We need to continue to be the voice of justice, not just for ourselves, but for those who don't have a voice." The people began to applaud again, shouting words of support. Ava, looking at her mother, felt that a new journey was just beginning. "I promise I won't stop, Mom. I'll fight for justice, not just for us, but for everyone who needs it." The community united in a chorus of support, and together they knew that truth and justice had prevailed. As they left the courtroom, arms intertwined, Ava and Danielle were met with warm hugs and grateful smiles. It was a new beginning, and hope shone brighter than ever. We've reached the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more accounts like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Right now, there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these touching stories, just click on it to start. And now, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and leave your like to support our work. Now, a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to know your opinion. Until the next video.